Hello everybody. Welcome to a brief survey of the Apocrypha. This is a continuation of a lesson that I delivered in person at a Sunday school class at Rose Drive Friends Church led by Greg Hertzler. So if you are in this class right now, hello! If you aren't in that class and are just watching it off my YouTube channel, welcome also. You don't need any further context really to understand the content of this video, but if you are in that Sunday school class, and you recall everything I said last Sunday about the history of the Apocrypha, its acceptance in various church traditions, and just a very general explanation of what it is, now we get to dive into what actually is in the Apocrypha, book by book. Like I said, this is just a brief survey. I will be going through each book very briefly to explain what the content is and how it's relevant to at least some church traditions. And hopefully answer most of your burning questions on what actually is in it. Just like the rest of the Bible that is accepted by everyone, Protestants, Orthodox, and Catholics, as canonical, there's wisdom literature, there is narrative, not so much laws in the sense that you would find in the Torah, but definitely an extension of many of the same kinds of literature that you see in the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Old Testament, with the exception of prophetic writing. Actually, let me put a little asterisk right there. There's not going to be a graphic on the screen, I'm just drawing it. There are a few books in the Apocrypha accepted by some Christian traditions that purport to be prophetic. However, most of these books say pretty plainly that the word of the Lord had not been heard among the Jews since the time of the prophets, basically since Malachi, which is the reason why Protestants generally don't accept these books as authoritative, because most of them say themselves that they haven't heard from God in a while. Okay, well, now with that out of the way, let's get into it. So, assuming that in the classroom my whiteboard is still there and still has all of my scrawlings on it on the contents of the Apocrypha, hopefully this will help you follow along. But if not, I'm first going to go over the books that are accepted as canonical in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, which is everything from Tobit to 2nd Maccabees. In case it's not on the board right now, those are Tobit, Judith, Greek Esther, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, the Letter of Jeremiah, the Prayer of Azariah, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. All right, so first, Tobit. Tobit is rather like Esther and Judith, which we'll get into later, in the sense that it is a short, almost novella-like story. Specifically, it has to do with a man named Tobit, who is a righteous Jew who fears God, and actually it mentions how he goes out of his way. If he finds a dead person on the side of the road, he buries him according to custom in a way that's respectful, and the way that a good Jew would bury someone instead of just letting him rot. So he is accounted as a righteous man. However, tragically, he becomes blind, and when this happens, he sends his son Tobias away to get married, so that they can continue on the family line, that they can have economic support, that sort of thing. So he sends Tobit off to Sarah. Let me double check that. Ah, yes, that's right. So they have a distant relative named Sarah, who is about Tobit's age, who about Tobias's age, who he is set to marry. The problem, however, though, is that Sarah is oppressed by a demon named Asmodeus, who kills all of her suitors right before they can consummate their marriage. So fortunately, on this journey, Tobias encounters a man in disguise, an angel in disguise as a man. He's really Raphael, but he calls himself Raguel. Now, Raguel travels with Tobias and keeps him safe. There's a little episode where they catch a fish, and Raguel tells Tobias how they can use part of it to eat, use another part of it for exorcisms, for fighting demons, and then another part of it for medicine. all of those will come in later. In the literary business, we call that Chekhov's gun. Eventually, they make their way to Sarah. Sarah's father is very happy that Tobias is there, but he is afraid for his life. So Tobias marries Sarah, and right before they consummate their marriage, of course, the demon comes and tries to kill Tobias, but using the special material that Raphael prepared for Tobias, he manages to exorcise the demon, and Raphael comes, binds the demon, and casts him away into Tartarus. So now Tobias and Sarah consummate their marriage and are married. Big happily ever after. When they return to see Tobit, Tobias's father, who by this point enough time has passed that he worries his son might be dead, he visits his father. He also takes the medicine that Raphael made for Tobias and uses it to cure Tobit's blindness. And it's all a happily ever after. It's a story about God's providence, and it's just a very fun story. I highly recommend it. All right, next is Judith. So just how some parts of Tobit were reminiscent of, say, I think it was Isaac who was sent. Yeah, that's right. Isaac was sent to Rebekah, one of his distant relatives, to marry her. Oh, I'm sorry, no. Isaac wasn't sent. The servant was sent to get Rebekah for Isaac. But just as there are parts of the Old Testament that are reflected in the story of Tobit, at least little themes, running themes there of being sent off to marry someone, but there's trouble and how God pulls through. Judith is very reminiscent of the episode in Judges when Deborah is judge, and I forget what ethnicity he was, but the general Sisera is killed by the Israelite woman Jael, who drives a tent peg into his temple and kills him and frees Israel from his oppression. Likewise, Judith is a very heroic woman who steps up and saves Israel from outside oppression. Now, what's tricky about this book is that it's technically historically inaccurate. It calls the enemies Assyrians, but if you read the chronology that the story gives, it's actually during the Babylonian captivity. That's part of the reason why Jews and Protestants don't consider this authoritative, because it is anachronistic. Perhaps purposefully so, since it's supposed to be a almost timeless story, and the enemies in the story are archetypical. They're the archetypal enemies of the Jews. In any case, so in the story, the Jews are being oppressed by the Assyrians and their general Holofernes. They are given an ultimatum while they're basically under siege to surrender in 5 days or something like that. Surrender within a few days, and if they don't, they'll come in and slaughter everyone. It will be a bloodbath. So the Jews bide their time to try to figure out what to do, whether they should surrender, whether they should mount resistance, whether they should wait for help to arrive from a neighboring country that's friendly with them. The elders of the Jews are perplexed, and they are very stressed. A widow, a very beautiful widow, I might add, Judith, steps up and tells everyone off for stalling and for not trusting in God. So she herself sneaks out of the city, goes down into the camp, the Assyrian camp, I should say, and very similar to Jael, goes into the tent of Holofernes, seduces him, doesn't sleep with him, but does flirt with him and gets him drunk. And as he falls asleep from how drunk he is, she takes his sword, beheads him, and while everyone else is asleep in the camp, takes his head, runs back to the Jewish city, shows everyone his head, and says that deliverance is upon them. So early the next morning, all the Assyrians realize that their commander is headless and freak out. And at that time, the Jews come down, mount a resistance against the Assyrians, and slaughter them all, thus saving the Jews from their enemies. Great story. There's actually a Renaissance painting, which if I edit this video later, maybe I will put it in here, of it's a painting of Judith slaying Holofernes and holding up his head with all the viscera hanging off of it. Great story, great Renaissance painting, great for kids. All right, that's Judith. Now, next is Greek Esther, sometimes called the rest of Esther, and sometimes simply called Rester. It's never called Rester, I made that up. Esther, at least Greek Esther, is the same story as Esther, but with additional passages in it that aren't present in the Hebrew text that Esther in most of our English Bibles is based off of. As some of you know, Hebrew Esther is the only book of the Bible that does not explicitly mention God by name. Greek Esther fixes that problem by having a bunch of additional chapters that very explicitly mention God. It includes a prayer by Mordecai and many other prayers. It includes a copy of the letter that the king Artaxerxes sent out. What's tricky about this, though, is that all of these additions to the book of Esther that are in the Greek are numbered 11 through, I think it's 11 through 16 or something like that. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, so all of these additions to the book of Esther are chapters 11 through 16, but they're not tacked on at the end of Esther. They actually take place in sporadic parts throughout the original narrative, just spliced in. So in the copy of the King James Version that I showed most of you last Sunday, that has the Apocrypha in it, its additions to the book of Esther just has chapters 11 through 16 and only kind of tells you at what point they take place in the narrative. In my NRSV Bible that has the Apocrypha, it much more helpfully puts the additions where they're supposed to be. So, for example, right here is chapter 8, and then it adds chapter 16, which actually takes place in the middle of chapter 8, where it's supposed to be. And then after that, oops, oh, my notes are falling out. After that addition, it continues chapter 8 as it originally appears in the narrative and moves on. Like I said, it doesn't really change the narrative all that much. It's just a DLC for the Book of Esther, for those of you who understand that reference. All right. Next, the Wisdom of Solomon. Another book of wisdom in the same vein as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, purports to be written by Solomon. According to the notes in my study Bible here, it says the author of this book thoroughly knew both the Old Testament and contemporary Greek culture. The book was probably written in Greek during the 1st century BC by a Hellenistic Jew in Alexandria, Egypt. So just like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, its theme is that all wisdom comes from God, who created the world by wisdom and continues to rule it by wisdom. True wisdom lives within the righteous. It guides them throughout their lives and assures them of immortality. Those who despise wisdom and disobey the law of God will, like the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus, be punished. In the last section of the Wisdom of Solomon, it goes throughout Israel's history and how God's wisdom is woven through it, and how wisdom is reflective of following the Torah, which means, again, the teaching rather than the law. So the Torah, rightly understood, is more wisdom literature rather than a legal code. That's why it's these laws and teachings woven through narrative rather than the U.S. code. Next is the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus. Another book of wisdom. It is about 50, yeah, it's 51 chapters long. And there are additions to Sirach, actually, at the very beginning, and then there's an ending epilogue that don't appear in the earliest versions of Sirach. So we have Apocrypha to the Apocrypha. The prologue is just a prologue. It just gives a history of this, or it just gives an origin to this particular book. It talks about Jesus ben Sirach, who is writing down the wisdom that his father also named Jesus, which was a popular name among Jews at that time, and how he wrote it down. Let's see. It should be noted that the other name for this book, Ecclesiasticus, indicates its wide use in early Christian communities for practical advice on daily living. So even as early as the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, new converts to Christianity, around the time they were baptized or shortly afterward, would be instructed in this book for wisdom and daily living, as part of their as part of their catechism, or at least as part of their discipleship process, what it means to live in a godly manner in everyday, day-to-day life. Also, for those of you who watched Chariots of Fire, that film about the Olympic runner, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. At the very beginning of that film, there is that verse that says, "Let us praise the works of famous men," or something like that. That is from this book. That's from Sirach. I cannot remember chapter and verse for that, but let's see. Maybe I can find it. Oh, here it is. Yeah, so that is Sirach chapter 44, verse 1. "Let us now sing the praises of famous men, our ancestors and their generations." So that appears at the very beginning of the film Chariots of Fire. That's where that's from. All right, next is Baruch. Baruch is named after Baruch, son of Neriah, who is the secretary of Jeremiah. And this purports to be one of his, another one of his writings. The first one, of course, being the book of Jeremiah, which are Jeremiah's prophecies from God. This is more of a treatise. It's more of what's the word that I'm looking for? It's more of a plea to the people of Judah to repent before God and to live righteously, rather than a book of prophecy. There's a letter to Jerusalem in it. It was on the tip of my tongue just now. Telling them to confess their sins, to pray for deliverance, praising the wisdom of God. Again, wisdom is very prevalent as a theme throughout the Apocrypha. Let's see. That's basically Baruch. It's only 5 chapters, except not really, depending on who you ask. The letter of Jeremiah, which is written on the board and is separated in my Bible as a separate book, is actually the 6th chapter of Baruch, which appears in some manuscripts but doesn't in others. It's usually styled as a continuation of Baruch, as a letter from Jeremiah to the Jews. This letter hurls harsh criticism at idols and demonstrates the foolishness of worshiping gods made by human hands. "It is you, O Lord, whom we must worship," which is verse 6 of the letter of Jeremiah. So once again, if you want to look up this particular text, you can look it up under the letter of Jeremiah, or Baruch chapter 6 if you want to read it online. Next, Azariah, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon are all additions to the biblical book of Daniel. They, like Esther, appear in the Greek version of the text, or at least some Greek versions of the text, but not in the original Hebrew. The prayer of Azariah is included in Daniel, at least in the Greek version of Daniel, right after chapter 3, verse 23, as the prayer that Azariah and his 2 friends say before they are thrown into the fiery furnace. Azariah is once again, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but they're in this prayer called by their Hebrew names, which they probably would have preferred to be called by, rather than the Babylonian names that we all know. I think Azariah is Shadrach. So the first part is the prayer that Azariah prays in the furnace while they're thrown in, and then afterward, they all three of them glorify God in the furnace, and it has this very long song blessing God through the rest of this text. There are some churches that use this in their liturgy during different parts of the church calendar, when there are Sundays dedicated to certain parts of the life of Christ, and they choose appropriate New Testament, Old Testament, and Apocrypha texts or passages to highlight that. So sometimes with churches that recognize this as canonical, or at the very least use it in their liturgy, that's when that would come up. Susanna is chapter 13 of the Greek version of Daniel. I really like the stories of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon. Bel and the Dragon is essentially chapter 14 of Greek Daniel, because it turns Daniel into a detective. It's a detective story. So first, in Susanna is a married woman, and she is very attractive. And there are two elders among the Jews who begin to lust after her, and they peep on her while she's bathing. They all realize that they are all peeping on her, so they conspire together to trap her and to try and seduce her, being, lusty old men. Yeah. So they attempt to seduce Susanna. It doesn't work because she is faithful to her husband and is not going to commit adultery. So instead, they threaten her and say, well, if you don't sleep with us, we will tell everyone that you try to seduce us, and that you are a wicked woman, and then they will stone you to death. So Susanna still stands firm and rejects their advances. And right as everyone comes, while they're hearing this commotion, the elders come out and they accuse Susanna of trying to seduce them and of being an unfaithful wife. So they prepare to stone her. Right then, Daniel intervenes and interviews each of the elders separately, and cross-examines their testimony and determines that their testimony doesn't line up. Most notably, they can't agree under what tree they saw Susanna when she was trying to seduce them. They are very different kinds of trees. So in the original Hebrew, when Daniel discovers this inconsistency in their testimony, he makes these very grim puns, very much like CSI Miami, puns about how what their punishment is going to be based on their false testimony. So there's one translation of this text that one of the elders, it renders it as saying that the elder says he saw Susanna under a yew tree, and Daniel says something to the effect of, because of your lies, you will be hewed in half, or something like it. It doesn't translate into English very well, but in the original Hebrew or Greek, I think it's Greek, they're very cheesy puns. And sure enough, the elder's lie is discovered, and they are stoned to death instead. Bel and the Dragon is a couple of stories. One is about an idol Bel. The second is about an actual living dragon, apparently, both of which the king of Babylon tells Daniel to bow down to. Excuse me, not Babylon. It is Cyrus the Persian. So Cyrus the Persian shows Daniel this great idol Bel, who they put food in front of every day, and it disappears every night because supposedly he eats it. So he says, Daniel, this is a real God, and here you should bow down and worship him. Daniel says, he smirks and says, that's a bunch of baloney. I'll prove it to you. So the king challenges him to prove it to him. Unbeknownst to everyone else, Daniel covers the floor of the room in flour overnight. And overnight, the priests and their families come in through a secret entrance, because Daniel has also locked the room off. They come in through a secret entrance and walk to the idol. They eat all the food, and then they leave. So the next morning, all the food's gone, and the king says, look, Daniel, he ate all the food. See, he's a real god. And Daniel says, well, look at the floor. There's a bunch of footprints there. I didn't tell anyone, but I put a bunch of flour there, and you can see it leads to this secret entrance. So they find out that the priests of Bel and their families had been faking it the whole time, and they're all executed. Great story. Then after that, there's this really weird story about how, let's see. There was a great dragon which the Babylonians revered. The king said to Daniel, you cannot deny that this is a living God, so worship him. Daniel says, no, I worship the Lord my God. He is the living God. But give me permission, O king. I will kill the dragon without sword or club. So the king says, I give you permission. Then Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair, boiled them together, and made cakes, which he fed to the dragon. The dragon ate them. This is apparently a living creature of some sort. I don't know. And then the dragon bursts open. And then Daniel says, see what you have been worshiping. So the Babylonians are indignant. They throw Daniel into the lion's den again. But then the prophet Habakkuk, who was in Judea, is told by an angel to go to the lion's den and to give food to Daniel. He's still in the lion's den. Of course, he survives. God protects him. And eventually he is freed. And here's a great line. The king shouted with a loud voice, you are great, O Lord, the God of Daniel, and there is no other besides you. Then he pulled Daniel out and threw into the den those who had attempted his destruction, and they were instantly eaten before his eyes. The end. I really like the stories of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon. They're great. They're great passages. Highly recommend them. I don't believe that they are the inspired, inerrant word of God, but they were written by pious Jews at this time, and at the very least, they are very entertaining to read. Now, the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, unlike 1st and 2nd Samuel, which was originally one book that was split into two, or 1st and 2nd Kings, which is same thing, one book split into two, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Maccabees are not part of the same work, nor is one a sequel to the other. They are written by completely different people, and they cover about the same time period. There's quite a bit of overlap. So 1st Maccabees is, let's see. I'll just read the descriptions from the NRSV Study Bible. This book gets its name from Judas Maccabeus, the leader of a group of Jews who sought to purify their people from the influence of the Hellenistic Greek culture. This group sought to free their nation from the Seleucid rulers, notably Antiochus IV, also called Epiphanes, who wanted to destroy the Jewish faith. This book recounts the exploits of Judas and his four brothers. The author of this book was undoubtedly a God-fearing Jew who wrote this history of the Maccabean period in Hebrew. Since the last event recorded in this book occurred in 135 BC, it was probably written near the end of the 2nd century BC. The main theme of this book is that God does not want his people to distort the religion of the Holy Scriptures to fit the ways of the pagan world. Those who stand up for authentic Judaism will receive help from the Lord and will achieve great victory in his name. Those of you who know the story of Hanukkah, that's part of this book. 2nd Maccabees, again, covers a lot of the same stuff. It's there's a lot of overlap. So I'll just read the description for that. 2nd Maccabees. This book claims to be a condensation of a 5-volume work by Jason of Cyrene on the life and times of Judas Maccabeus. Even more than First Maccabees, it stresses the miraculous intervention of God during this critical period of Jewish history. We have no evidence of Jason's original 5-volume work from which this book claims to be abridged, and we have no idea who abridged it. But the writing style makes it clear that the author wrote in Greek. The book was likely written during the first half of the 1st century BC by a God-fearing Jew. The sanctity of the temple and God's directing of history are unifying themes in this book. God defends his people from being desecrated by pagans and protects and delivers those who strive for personal holiness. This is one of the first Jewish writings that clearly portray the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Those of you who were present last week will remember that I read a passage from 2 Maccabees 14 in which Judith and his comrades pray for their recently departed because they were carrying idols of Gemnia on them, and that's the reason why they fell in battle, because they shouldn't have done that. Otherwise, they were pious Jews. They pray on their behalf, and Judas takes up a collection to send to Jerusalem for the temple as a sin offering. And the book makes a side comment saying, this is a pious thing that he did. If he didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, this would have been a pointless task. But because the resurrection of the dead is a real thing that's going to come, praying for these recently departed souls was pleasing to God. And it's that passage that on which the indulgence system and praying on behalf of people who have already died and are in purgatory, and also praying to the saints in general. That's where that justification comes from in the Roman Catholic Church, especially during the medieval period when the church was very corrupt and they were telling people they can reduce the amount of time that their loved ones have to spend in purgatory before going to heaven by giving them money to build St. Peter's Basilica. And we all know how that turned out in 1517. That's 2 Maccabees. Oh, really quick though, there is another, let's see, I forget if it's 1st or 2nd Maccabees. I think it's 2nd Maccabees. There is there's a passage in 2nd Maccabees about a mother and her 7 sons, which are killed one by one under the orders of Antiochus, because each of them will not renounce the faith and accept Greek religion. So Antiochus says all you have to do is renounce Torah and you will live. And each of the sons, from the oldest to the youngest, and then finally the mother, are brutally executed for their faith. We'll come back to that later. So that is in 2nd Maccabees somewhere, if I can only find it. Let me see. Okay, 2nd Maccabees chapter 7, the martyrdom of 7 brothers. We will come back to that story later because that's actually repeated in another one of the Apocryphal books, which we will get to eventually. Okay, so after 2nd Maccabees, those are all of the books of the Apocrypha that are accepted by both the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. The books from 1st Esdras through 3rd Maccabees are recognized as deuterocanonical scripture, which means also canonical scripture, by the Greek and Russian churches. They are not so recognized by the Roman Catholic Church, but 1st Esdras and the prayer of Manasseh, together with 2nd Esdras, are placed in an appendix to the Latin Vulgate Bible. 1st Esdras is just Ezra. Esdras is the Greek version of the name Ezra. It starts actually with the last chapter of 2nd Chronicles, and then it's the whole book of Ezra from the Hebrew, but translated into Greek, and then it has the first part of Nehemiah at the very end. It's just Ezra with parts of 2nd Chronicles and Nehemiah translated into Greek, with the addition of an extra chapter in which, here we go, in chapter 3 of 1st Esdras, there is a debate among 3 bodyguards of which is the strongest, wine, the king, women, and truth. So the third bodyguard, who actually is Zerubbabel, argues that women and finally truth are stronger than anything else, including the power of wine and the power of the king. And because he answered well, the king rewards him, and that puts Zerubbabel into a position of power and friendship with the king that he uses later to ask for the return of the Jews to their homeland and to rebuild the walls. That's first Esdras. Second Esdras is... Where did I put that? Second Esdras. Here we go. Second Esdras is not right next to first Esdras in my Bible, so I have to skip around. Second Esdras is included in the Slavonic Bible as third Esdras, but it's not found in the Greek. It's also included to the appendix to the Latin Vulgate Bible as fourth Esdras. So in the Latin Vulgate Bible, what we call Ezra is first Esdras, what we call Nehemiah is second Esdras, Greek Ezra, which I just called first Esdras, is third Esdras, and this book is fourth Esdras. Confusing, I know. The Apocrypha tends to be like that. Second Esdras claims to be a series of apocalyptic visions, similar in style to Revelation, given to Ezra the scribe. The visions were intended to help God's people affirm God's power, goodness, and justice in the midst of the wickedness and cruelty of those who ruled over them. The book of Second Esdras was written in 3 sections at 3 times. Chapters 3 through 14, the core of the book, were written in Hebrew by an unknown Palestinian Jew at the end of the 1st century AD. About 50 years later, a Christian writer composed chapters 1 and 2 in Greek as an introduction, and almost a century after that, another Greek-speaking Christian wrote the final two chapters. One theme of Second Esdras is the denunciation of the wickedness of the Roman Empire, but the central part of this book struggles with and provides answers to the problem of evil and suffering in a world created by a loving God. It addresses particularly the suffering of God's people. According to the book, Ezra received several visions of the signs of the end times and confirmation that the righteous, though few in number, will be saved. All right. Second Esdras is 16 chapters long, and they tend to be long chapters, but it is a very interesting book. There's also, I can't remember where it is exactly, but there is an offhanded, there's an offhand part of Second Esdras in which the angel tells Ezra in a vision to basically seal up 70 books. 24 of those, he says, should be available to everybody, but the rest are sealed up until the end times or something like that. The 24 books are probably the 24 books of the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh. As I discussed last Sunday, what we consider 39 books in the Protestant Old Testament are 24 books in the Hebrew canon because they're divided differently. Some books are divided into 2 in Hebrew, and others are 1 book. But it's essentially the Old Testament. The other 70 books might reference some books of the Apocrypha, or it could be like how John writes some things on a scroll in Revelation. He's instructed to write, but then it's sealed up and no one will see it until it's opened at the end of days or something like that. Who knows? Anyways, interesting side note there, and it gives us an idea that at least the 24 books of the Hebrew canon among Jews were standardized by the 1st century. So there's that. Okay, I'm approaching 40 minutes, so I will try to wrap up really quick. Let's see. All right, the prayer of Manasseh. According to 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 18, Manasseh was the worst king that Judah had. However, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verses 11 through 13, when he was taken captive to Babylon, he prayed to the Lord. In response, God restored him to his position as king of Judah for a brief time before his death. The chronicler, the author of the books of Chronicles, also said that Manasseh's prayer to God was written down, which is in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verses 18 through 19. This book claims to be a copy of that prayer. It probably isn't, but if if that prayer is written down somewhere that still exists, it might look something like this. So it's a confession of sin. It is a praise to God. It's not that long. It's only 15 verses long, but it's very interesting. Okay, next, Psalm 151. Most manuscripts of the Septuagint have 151 psalms, this one being the last one. The translator, however, acknowledged that this one was outside the number. That is, not one of the generally accepted 150 psalms. This psalm claims to be a psalm of David written after his defeat of Goliath. A Hebrew copy of it has been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, indicating that it was originally written in Hebrew. From its contents and style, there is no reason to deny that it may have been an early psalm of David, perhaps his first one. So basically, David praises God for helping him to defeat Goliath and anointing him king of Israel. It's a very short psalm. It's only 7 verses. Side note, there are also additional apocryphal psalms that are a lot more obscure. So there are Psalms 152 through 155, which are in some manuscripts. I've read them before. I can't remember all the contents of them, but I think they all purport to be written by David, and they have something to do with the kingship of Israel. Then there are I think there are 18 Psalms that aren't part of the canonical Bible that claim to be written by Solomon. They're called the Psalms of Solomon. And then additionally, there are odes of Solomon, which are different. So these texts are in even more obscure places. There are medieval copies of it. There are early, maybe 3rd or 4th century copies of these things that are found in some Christian communities, but at no point were they ever accepted as canonical by any Christian tradition, to my knowledge. They were circulated, though. They were circulated. All right. Finally, I'm going to finish up with 3rd and 4th Maccabees, and then hopefully you guys have enough time. Maybe I'm going to speed this up in post. Who knows? 3rd Maccabees. This book seems to be misnamed because its events precede the Maccabean period by almost 50 years. The only justification for its title is that the book's theme of God's intervention in the persecution of his people is also prominent in 2nd Maccabees. Basically, this is a 9-chapter book about Ptolemy trying to oppress the Jews and have them deny their faith, and he fails. He tries to execute all of the faithful Jews. He's thwarted by God through a miraculous intervention. At the very end, he becomes sick, and he realizes the error of his ways. And really sick too. Like it's very, really horrible disease. Can't find it. Anyways, he does get brutally sick, so he writes a letter to the Jews saying that he releases them back to their home and that they can worship God as they wish, and he acknowledges God as the Most High God. The historical Ptolemy probably didn't do that. He did die from a very horrible sickness, according to some accounts, though. Yeah, that's 3rd Maccabees for you. Pretty good. Finally, 4th Maccabees, which is the final book of the Apocrypha I will be going over today, that before we go into really obscure stuff, which if you want to invite me back another Sunday, maybe we'll go over the really obscure biblical or semi-biblical texts, but this is the final one I have for today. 4th Maccabees. Remember, so I talked about in 2nd Maccabees chapter 7, the story of the 7 martyred brothers and their mother. This is an extension of that story. 4th Maccabees takes its name from the Maccabean period in which its events took place. It's essentially a sermon that extols and commemorates the martyrdom of Eleazar and of a mother with her 7 sons, recorded in 2nd Maccabees chapters 6 and 7. The sermon may first have been preached on the Feast of Dedication, that is Hanukkah, the festival that celebrated the Maccabees gaining control of and purifying the temple. So, here we are. The unknown author of First Maccabees was obviously well versed in the Greek language and in Greek philosophy, but thoroughly Jewish in his thinking. The book was likely written in Greek between 63 BC and 70 AD. The main intent of the book is to demonstrate that Jewish wisdom, which can be obtained only from God through his law, is fully compatible with the Greek philosophy that reason is the supreme guide of human behavior. To the author, only Judaism embodies true philosophy. So, the Jewish and Christian traditions talk about revealed wisdom, wisdom that's revealed from God to man, that man can't discover on his own. Greek and Hellenistic philosophy focuses on wisdom. It believes that all wisdom can be discovered by human reason, and certainly some of it can be. But according to the argument of the author of this book is that you don't have a whole picture of wisdom or of philosophy unless you're a Jew, and that it is rational to die for your faith, even in brutal ways, because of the resurrection of the dead and the vindication of the faithful. All right, well, that's everything I have for today. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the comments below, or if you see me at church, you can walk up to me and bug me and ask me all of your obscure apocryphal questions or anything else that has to do with the Bible or the history around it. I love that sort of stuff. I've really enjoyed talking about this today, and I really enjoyed teaching in person last week. I hope you've enjoyed this very long video, and have a great day. God bless you. Bye.